Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the webinar today by TiE SoCal. This is a screen. Everybody can see my screen. Nitin, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So a little bit about TiE Global and TiE SoCal. So TiE Global started in 1992 in the Silicon Valley, and we started about 23 years ago in 1997. We do monthly events pre-COVID era, but now we have turned it into a webinar series. And almost for the last 1.5 months, we have been doing one webinar a day. Some of the upcoming events are TiE SoCal Connect on Mondays and Fridays between 4 p.m. and 5 p.m. Out of that, other than that, there are 2 other events planned for this month, and we are also looking for another event on June 25th. And it will be provided in an email, as well as we will market it via our social media. With that, Nitin, back to you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anshuman. Hey, everyone. Welcome to TiE SoCal. We are looking forward to having a riveting discussion today with a phenomenal panel talking about innovation in supply chain. The world's supply chain has been disrupted. I know it's a bold statement, but an understatement nonetheless, considering the impact it has had on all of us, some visible and a lot of it under the hood. As we start to open back up, it is expected that we're going to see significant changes in the business dynamics. One of the most important decisions for companies is to secure their supply chains to be something that's effective and reliable. And the biggest challenge is there is no playbook. Right? Organizations are making these decisions based on whatever information is available, and there isn't a whole lot that's out there. And hence, this panel is going to provide those key insights that companies and businesses need to figure out where to go next. And also look at opportunities for entrepreneurs like us in what lies ahead. What are some of the new doors that are going to open up? And where should we be focusing on as we start to look at this new future that is coming up ahead of us? Now, as we have this discussion, I would highly encourage you guys to put your questions in the Q&A, and I see some of you have already started doing that, so thank you. And I would like to open up this discussion and go around the panel and ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves and tell us what they were working on right before COVID hit, and how have they needed to shift, or as we call it, pivot what they were working on, and where they see going from here in the next 6 to 12 months. So with that, I want to open it up. I'm going to go alphabetically, so you guys have some heads up. I want to open it up and talk to Arvind first. Arvind?
Good morning. My name is Arvind Vasu. I work at ABB Technology Ventures as an investor based in India, and looking at investment opportunities in Asia, which is India plus China at the moment. And prior to COVID, we were screening startups and closing deals, and we still continue to do that. The big difference now is that I don't travel, working out of home, and getting on a lot of Zoom and Skype calls, but the activity continues, and surprisingly still very busy, and I guess a lot of us are, and we're looking forward to getting back to a situation where we can actually meet our startup founders and VC partners in person again. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Arvind. Ashutosh.
Hi, good morning, folks. This is Ashutosh Mayank. I manage and lead the Supply Chain Labs platform. Supply Chain Labs platform is arguably India's largest supply chain focused platform connecting various ecosystems and various partners in this platform. We basically come in three avatars. One is the fund where we invest in supply chain and logistics focused startups. Second is Accelerator, where we choose and lead to a growth journey, few of the startups that we select as a cohort members. And the third, we have corporate programs where we help mid-size and large corporates actually envision their journey in the supply chain and logistics space. So, Nitin, to answer your question, right? Before this COVID era hit, we were running the accelerator and we wrapped up the accelerator. And it was a good interaction between startups and corporates, right? Now, post-COVID, we keep interacting with startups in a variety of ways. Their focus has changed. But the biggest shift that I have seen, Nitin, is actually in the mindsets of corporates. Now, if corporates were innovating earlier, they are now looking at disrupting their own systems, left, right, and center. And that's the biggest mindset change that I see. And we work with a number of corporates as a part of the corporate programs. And this is one learning that we have.
That's very insightful. Charles, what's going on with you?
Hey, so my name is Charles Owen. I'm a partner at EV2 Ventures, which is a early stage venture fund based in Gurgaon in Delhi, investing in smart mobility. So we define that as anything that moves people or things in the ecosystem pre-Series A. So supply chain logistics tech. So we have seen Arvind and Ashutosh many times and work together. Electric vehicles, electric vehicle system, micromobility, farm to fork, those are the types of areas that we're interested in investing. Before COVID-19, I was waking up every day in Gurgaon in New Delhi and screening companies, as Arvind said, and working with people to, working with investors to raise funds. And once COVID hit, I'd left India and now I'm talking to you from Atlanta and I hope to be back in India as soon as it's safe, sooner rather than later, hopefully. And we moved to having, kind of calls on cash with our companies and really focused on operational efficiency because we didn't know how long this is going to last. Luckily, being in the supply chain logistics, technology area, all of our companies were actually operating, delivering essential goods and services, and we actually saw demand increase for a handful of our startups. So that aspect is a little bit of a shining silver lining. As far as the next 12 months, I hope I see things, at least globally, people seem to think that if we're not at least pulling out of this storm, that we're at least ready to venture out. I don't know that if there's a difference there. And so we're moving back to normal. We're talking to investors and starting to screen startups again. So that's how we view this. I have no idea what the difference between 6, 12, and 18 months would be, but it looks like at least things are starting to roll now.
It's on the up and up, so that's a good thing. Well, Oliver, before I let you speak, I want to thank you. It's what, 2:30 in the AM for you, so thank you for making it. And please go on and tell us what's going on.
Thanks, Nitin. So my name is Oliver Lemansky. I'm the CEO of a company called On Process Technology, and we specialize in the service supply chain. So being able to get to power service operations in the after sales sector. And we do that for big global companies like Cisco and HP and Juniper and as well as big communications players like Comcast and AT&T. And we have operations in India, and we have operations in Europe, and we have operations in Costa Rica and in the US. We're headquartered out of Boston. I'm in the UK at the moment. If you look at what we were doing before COVID hit, we were looking at how we could, what the roadmap looked like to further develop the digitization of the service supply chain. So service supply chain and the aftermarket supply chain has been a little bit kind of behind the curve, if you like, in terms of innovation and digitization. And On Process has really been a kind of thought leader, or at least I hope that's how we're seen. We invest a lot in understanding how we can drive digitization in the service supply chain. I completely agree with Ashutosh in terms of what did we see. Initially, there was a sort of panic of some things sort of stopped as sort of people thought, oh, what's going on? And then the sort of novelty, if you like, and I don't mean that in a positive sense, of all of us being at home and around our kids and what have you, that sort of wore off. And businesses went back to sort of, okay, how can we make decisions? But as Ashutosh said, we need to innovate, we need to disrupt, and we need to do it quickly, because our entire cost base, our whole volume structure, our reliance on partners, the SLAs that we're being able to offer and deliver onto customers, that's all just gone out the window. And now we're in a disruptive economy. So now it's actually helped to sort of accelerate, if you like, our digitization plans for our customers. And as Charles says, where we end up in 6 months or 12 months or 18 months, I mean, it's a slight wheel of fortune on when it comes to COVID-19. But I look forward to that ongoing digitization and the innovation that's currently sitting in the supply chain.
Thanks, Oliver. Prajakth, tell us what's going on in your world.
Thanks, Nitin. Folks, good evening, good morning. My name is Prajakth Raut. I call myself an entrepreneurship evangelist, somebody who's very passionate about promoting entrepreneurship as a career option for a lot of young people. Deeply involved with TiE for several years. I've been in the startup ecosystem now for about 16, 17 years. In 2004, 5, 6, I'd taken the sabbatical to run the Asia office for TiE. I now run a platform called Apply5, where we manage innovation and startup programs for corporates, as well as for some governments. And to answer your question, Nitin, I would agree with what Ashutosh and Oliver mentioned. There are a lot of corporates who were earlier looking at innovation and startup engagement programs as a interesting side activity to do to figure out if there's something interesting that pops up, are now getting deeply involved with the startup ecosystem with very specific use cases. Mm-hmm. They are trying to understand from their peers as well in terms of what their response to whatever the new normal has been. But one significant difference that we are seeing between the way corporates were looking at innovation earlier and now is that previously they would look for innovations that could be integrated or be built as a part of their legacy systems. And now, because they don't know whether this new normal is going to be a permanent new normal or if it's going to be a temporary new normal, they are more open to SaaS products and a lot of other solutions that will allow them to be nimble and adjust their responses as the market evolves. That's one big difference that we see right now.
Again, that's so interesting to hear. Rohit, tell us what you've been up to.
Good morning, good evening. Thanks, Nitin. So my name is Rohit Bhayana. I'm a managing partner and a co-founder at Loomis Partners. We've been investing in businesses in supply chain, predominantly between the US and India for the last 10, 12 years. Other than supply chain, we've been fairly deep in digital learning. And the third area we've been in is operations, technology, IoT, industrial IoT, blockchain, all those things. So those are areas we have been in, and over the years, I think the intensity of all these things have been becoming more and more relevant. Just fortunately for us with COVID, the first thing was obviously the first 0 AM moment was immediately taking stock of cash across the portfolio. I think it hit us like it must have hit most of us, that how long is it going to be? What's the recovery going to be like? Is it going to be, are we even going to be able to see in some of our portfolio companies the next morning? Having gone through that and having gone through that over several cycles, I think the part where the strength of the portfolio, the strength of the businesses start showing up was where most of these companies, and I think that holds true for everyone, most of these companies went beyond reaction to survival to innovation for thriving. And by innovation for thriving, I think it's broadly been driven where we have seen in those portfolio companies where they're partnering with certain corporates, which are very keen to now look at brushing aside any excuse that was there. And that's such a refreshing thing for us. That there were so many excuses of why not to do things. And with COVID, most of those excuses have just gone away. So the best thing that has happened is you're very clearly in in this period of COVID, where you're beyond the reaction and now you're into the introspection of who are the best partners to work with, you're very able and very clearly able to see who are the people you want to invest and build with and who are the people you do not want to. And that is because this is the time when all excuses get off the table.
That's one thing for sure is I hear a lot of birds. So that tells me the changes that are coming out are very positive. So Vikas, go on and tell us what's going on your side.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I'm with Shell Ventures, the venture capital arm for Shell Energy. I'm based in San Francisco. Been here for quite a while. Mostly come from the operating background, but been in the venture side for the last 3 years now. Shell invests in early stage companies, anywhere from seed stage to late stage companies, and we have offices globally. We have a person in India, we have offices in China, Europe, and the US. I am in the San Francisco office, and we invest in 3 verticals. Our traditional oil and gas, what we call our resources vertical, where we invest in all the industrial IoT stuff, industrial automation stuff, as well as carbon reduction. Then we invest in the power domain throughout the whole vertical, whole value chain. Shell wants to be one of the largest power producer by 2030, so we have big ambitions there. And on the supply chain side, we have a mobility vertical where we invest in supply chain, logistics, fleet services, those areas for investment. And before COVID, I think it was February, we were looking for making more investments. And then suddenly for us, it was a double whammy. There was COVID as well as the oil prices crashing. And I think the impact of that was initially from a day-to-day perspective, we were busy working with our portfolio companies. We have about 80 companies in our portfolio. So we were busy working, helping them out to make sure that they have sufficient runway. But at the same time, because of the drop in oil prices, I think a few oil companies have done that, especially the European ones. I think the acceleration to reduction in carbon has become even more important for us. So our new energy business has become even more critical for Shell. So we're now looking at a lot more deals, definitely spending a lot more time on Zoom calls and not physically going anywhere and meeting anyone. And we are actively investing for sure as well. And looking forward in the next 6 to 12 months, I mean, definitely getting out of the house and meeting our companies, the companies we invest in is the key thing for us.
Thank you, Vikas. And thank you, gents. We are clearly missing out on diversity here. No women on the panel. And believe me, we tried, but we weren't able to do much of it. So I'm going to hand it over to Ashutosh to group this into our first panel and have a deeper dive into some of the topics. So Ashutosh, why don't you take over and kick us off?
Sure.
Thank you.
Sure. One thing which we have heard from all the panelists is a big change that has happened in whichever form and shape that they were working with and whichever area that they were concentrating on, right? And at the very least, the focus has gotten laser sharp in terms of what we want to do, because the resources are thin, we all are confined, and there is limited way in which the world can function efficiently these days, right? One of the binding threads this panel has is actually supply chain and logistics, right? Because either you are an investor, and we have good representations here of a couple of investors, a couple of large corporates whose big focus is supply chain, and their internal workings are a part of supply chain. Service providers in supply chain, and then in industry experts, right? So let me actually pull in first ABB. So Arvind Vasu, right? And Arvind, let's build upon the thread that you were talking about, right? That we have increasingly doubled down on looking at innovative companies in supply chain. But before that, Arvind, what does ABB do in India? How are you functioning?
Thanks, Ashutosh. I mean, we're a global organization, so our strategic focus is pretty much uniform, whether we invest in the Americas, Europe, or Asia, and we concentrate on 3 main areas. One is the the future of cities and buildings and homes, where you get into the smart city, smart building space. We're also focused on mobility, being a supplier of fast chargers internationally. And then we look at the future of industry. And of course, here, the things we're looking for is efficient energy management, storage, charging infrastructure, and in terms of the industrial side, both continuous processes like cement and metals and chemicals and etc., as well as discrete manufacturing using more robot-based automation. And technologies, of course, we do the whole gamut of all the buzzwords like AI and ML and IoT, etc. In terms of supply chain, we're really keen to look at the mobility side, what's happening there, the different kinds of business models in the West are like fast charging, whereas India will have different solutions like battery swapping, etc. In terms of industry, we're also looking at what else could we do by partnering with startups, because we start looking beyond the actual industrial plant from for example, in food and beverage, we're looking a lot at from farm to fork. In terms of our robot industry, we're also looking at new types of application, not just purely industrial, but warehouse automation and many other consumer-driven applications. You're on mute, Ashutosh.
My bad. So Arvind, you talked about a number of focus areas and how you are concentrating on certain subsectors and initiatives inside those focus areas. Right? Yep. Surely a company as large as ABB can look at all the innovations in the field. Why focus on startups, one? And why create a program as solid as Synerleap? Would love to hear your views on that.
Of course, you can do a lot yourself as a corporate, and but it takes a long time. We realized a few years ago that when it goes from actual idea to a solution or a ready product or system, it can take up to 10 years, in spite of having 5,000-6,000 PhDs in our R&D. So one way of really innovating and going to market faster is by working with startups to sort of bring that mentality and innovation speed into an organization. So that's really what we're looking for. We can, of course, provide customer access. I mean, this is a typical corporate venture capital philosophy, but we provide customer access and pilot and proof of concept opportunities for startups. So if you really look at ABB Technology Ventures, yes, we like to invest, and we normally invest in more mature startups who are in Series A and Series B type of investments and later stage. But then we have Synerleap, which is our innovation hub or corporate accelerator, which is now a global program where we get to also work with startups which are more early in their development. And that becomes like a live due diligence where we get to observe them closely. Some of them get funded, and we also look at we have opportunity to look at technologies and business models which are a little more on the fringes of what we do today, and that's the idea.
Well, that's great. That's great, Arvind. And I hear the necessity for having startup-led innovation in a large ecosystem as ABB, right? Let's shift focus a little bit, right? And let's go and talk to an investor which is focusing on supply chain and logistics investments as one of the focus areas. So I would request Rohit to talk about how the clients of portfolio companies started looking at increased digitization, because Loomis Partners, and I'm a big part of that, Loomis Partners essentially is in deep connect and has deep relationships with various corporates, directly as well as with the portfolio companies. So what are you hearing these days from various corporates on their own supply chain?
So Ashutosh, that's a great question. One of the big reasons why, and Ashutosh, you know this very well, and perhaps at some point of time you should add on to your own very question, because you're such a fundamental part of it. I think in Loomis, as we work very closely with our businesses, one thing we observed, and that also led into the creation of Supply Chain Labs, one of the things we observed was that innovative, and this also builds on what Arvind was saying, innovation center of gravity, innovation dollars, and innovation blossoming are unfortunately all apart. Innovation center of gravity is always with the startups, and this has historically been the case. Innovation blossoming happens when corporates, industry, businesses, the community, the ecosystem starts absorbing it well. And dollars are in between, coming from investors like us who are making all this happen. All of this, and this even before COVID, was fairly broken. I've struggled to see corporates absorb innovation well. And they've absorbed, and companies like ABB and companies like Shell, and I'm saying this because I do know them very well for how deep and structured programs they have, but largely corporate venture programs, which are very rich in innovation charter and investment charter, are fewer. And the agenda still is strategic, which basically means let's get in and acquire and build out from there. Very rarely would you see programs which are just investing to building to be part of the innovation life cycle. I think what happened with COVID is even more so that breakpoint, or that disaggregation between the three critical pivots happened. But then the realization also came very quickly that, and precisely to the point Ashutosh you were making, when resources are so thin, all the more so for everyone, but even all the more so for corporates, as much for startups, you want to do what you do best. You want to focus on what you do best. You want to focus on your operations. You want to focus on areas which are delivering value day in and day out to your customers. You want to improve the value of your products. But you cannot look 2, 3, 4 years ahead as a periscope and start investing in innovations which are going to cannibalize you those many years out. You just can't. Well, you might, but you will be accelerating that journey much more with startups. I think startups, on the other hand, are completely choked off capital. I'm sure this situation will reverse, but they're completely choked off capital. And their ability to somehow work with these startups in a program where they can start picking some very real problems of these corporates, chisel them, refine them, make them suitable to what their focus as an innovation hub is, and then quickly deploy value to those corporates is very critical. So how quickly can I pick Shell, ABB, Cisco's problem? How quickly can I pivot my solution set to work for that problem? I'm still within my ground of my product of innovation, but I'm tweaking it around the edges to suit an ABB or suit a Cisco or suit a Shell. And then I'm redeploying it with value back to them, is what's going to really take them far ahead than where they are. And specifically where they just can't keep investing in product development forever because dollars are deprived. So I think this is how we are seeing it all come together. And Supply Chain Labs was birthed with that thought process, that let's take the best of the corporates and their big problem statements. Let's take the best of the startup ecosystem, which is innovating in supply chain, and let's marry the two together to make this short circuit happen.
No, makes sense. Makes sense, and I'll add on to what you were saying pretty soon on how these corporates and these startups have started working together very, very closely, even more so in current day and time, right? But let me first come to Charles. Right, Charles, once again, as an investor who has been looking at the India-US axis, right? Are you seeing a shift in the buyer behavior? Because earlier, the buyers or the clients of the portfolio companies were asking for something else, and now they have completely changed their focus and asking for something else. Is that happened, or it's a gradual, spectrum shift that has happened?
Sure, I think there's a gradual spectrum shift that has been kind of accelerated with the COVID issue, but let's just back up and tell the story for a minute. So first of all, we invest only in Indian startups investing in, that are solving Indian problems. So it's very specific to the Indian ecosystem. And if you go back in India a handful of years, everything was very localized before GST was passed. You had kind of this local supply chain and local delivery, and Flipkart and Amazon are relatively new, and then Swiggy and Zomato are even newer. And when you take the density of population of India, 1.3 billion people, so multiple times, the United States and Europe, 2x the US and Europe combined, and in an infrastructure that's having that's struggling to keep up with where it currently has, and then move into a digitized platform where everyone has a cell phone, where Indians are the largest users of cell phone data globally per smartphone, not per capita, because there's still many people that don't have cell phones, but for those with cell phones, it's the largest user, or the largest users of data. And that's really put tremendous strains on, we'll just take the kind of e-com food delivery, last mile, supply chain and logistics platforms. Of course, those all pull from warehouse tech, mid-mile, and first mile as well, because you have to get all of the goods eventually to the last mile. But when you have those types of scale in companies that didn't exist and becoming unicorns, then analog solutions that previously worked, because labor was relative and still is relatively cheap, can't solve the problem, especially when you have infrastructure issues. And so what we've seen is innovative startups coming up with solutions. And in one situation, one of our companies, beating out SAP with a bid with a large automotive OEM, and something that you wouldn't see in the West, with dealing with a startup. And so the technology innovation that's happening with the startups on the ground, recognizing that the problems are just so dramatic, because you have in India a kind of a combination of industry 1.0 at the same time as you have industry 4.0. You don't really have the steps like you have in the West. It kind of is dirt floors, or there's a little bit of middle, and then you have Arvind's world, where you have robots and AI and ML, and then you're kind of trying to combine all of those at the same time. And out on the streets, it really is this mishmash of really interesting high-end technology in an analog process. Because at the end of the day, supply chain and logistics is analog, right? I have to take something from here and move it over there. Now, if the only thing that what's happening now is the scale of the technological revolution in last mile warehouse management, warehouse solutions, where people are delivering, Amazon type SLAs to SMBs, and then, innovations in the EV life cycle, where it's EVs designed for the Indian environment, 44 degrees, dusty, hot, and, price point is really interesting. And those demands from 3 years ago to today, where you used to have kind of conversations where that's really neat, we'll see where it is. And now, with, for example, one of the EV companies that we're invested in, I'm in the weird situation of being a venture investor saying, slow down your order book, because we're a year out on production. And that would have been inconceivable 2.5 years ago, 2 years ago.
That makes sense. Makes sense. So these kinds of shifts on, the kind of behavior that you are seeing, predicated by the fact that in India specifically, you have high-end technologies and analog processes merged together, specifically in supply chain, lead to an interesting observation from my side as well, right? So what I have been seeing and observing is that there's a difference between good to do and must to do, and that difference has been spread apart like anything, where anything which was good to do has been really dropped, and anything which is must to do has been focused on in a very, very concentrated manner, right? And there are certain must to do's that we all are seeing, especially in supply chain logistics. One is the fact that digitization and making the processes light up is a big focus area, to the fact that I would love in the next panel for Oliver to talk about how some of the clients are looking at control tower solutions, because visibility, even before you start moving things, you need to know where things are, right? So visibility is a big theme out there. The next big theme that we are seeing is risk aversion and mapping out your own processes to figure out bottlenecks. And that used to happen, even otherwise, right? But right now, there's active discussions on various fronts, be it diversification of sourcing requirements and sourcing geographies for that matter, be it taking insurance and having a proper risk index in the corporate to figure out where our various processes are and what is the risk of actually getting them disrupted, and so on and so forth. So I'll stop here. I would actually request Prajakth to take on the next panel, and let's talk about certain specific things where India is emerging as a strategic destination in the whole supply chain and logistics ecosystem throughout the world.
Yeah. Sure, Ashutosh. Thanks. But before I go on to the next panel, I just want to add on to a couple of observations, especially what we've seen in the supply chain and logistics space. One is a lot more corporates are rushing to look at what startups are doing, because they know that the speed to market with the solution is going to be of utmost importance. And therefore, even corporates that were sitting on the sidelines or were very casually looking at the startup ecosystem are now actively, proactively reaching out and seeking solutions. That's one thing. However, as Ashutosh, we've seen in the supply chain labs as well, that when a corporate gives a problem statement or a use case, it is almost never that there will be one startup that we can find and say, okay, here's the solution to this problem. Here's a startup that will address everything. I think what we are realizing increasingly is that when you identify a problem statement, somebody has to creatively stitch together a solution which would probably need to integrate 3 or 4 solutions from maybe 2 or 3 or 4 different startups, and maybe some other technologies as well for it to be a comprehensive solution for the problem statement. And therefore, even more important, the role of the kind of programs like supply chain labs, which help a lot of corporates actually find the right kind of solutions from that. That's one of the observations that we've seen. So thank you, folks. Moving on to the next panel, Vikas, I'd like to start with you. Shell obviously declares India as a very important constituent of your overall, global strategy. And as the world realigns, many other corporates will also be looking at India from a very strategic point of view. But it's a very, while there are lots of opportunities, while India brings in a tremendous amount of scale, both on the demand and the supply side, it is also an extremely complex market that companies have to understand how to navigate. Almost any adjective that you can use for India, even if it is true, in most cases, even the right exact opposite of that adjective is going to be applicable in the Indian context. And therefore, that complexity is something that needs to be, companies have to understand how to navigate and deal with the complexity that India brings. Because if you can therefore highlight what has been Shell's focus in India, apart from, of course, it being a market, what are the other components within India that you're seeing from an innovation, from sourcing, from people and the other parts? And at some point, I would also like you to talk about the very successful E4 program, where you engage with startups in the areas that you're connected with.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm new to Shell, but I think from what I know, Shell has been in India for a long time. I think it first was in India in the 1920s. In the 1950s, Shell opened the first petrochemical plant in India, but then Shell was nationalized in the 70s, and then it came back to India in the 1990s. And since then, it has grown quite tremendously. One of the big source for Shell is the technology workforce in India. So Shell has built a technology center in India that was started in 2007, I think. There are only 3 of them in the world. There's one in the US in Houston, one in Amsterdam, and the third one was chosen to be in Bangalore. These are technology centers where innovation, engineering, development, any kind of technical work is done to support the region that it's based in. And I think it currently has more than 1,000 people employed, where they are developing new methods of mostly in the traditional oil and gas side. But now, as Shell is moving more into the renewable side, decarbonization side, looking at new programs to develop and commercialize them, not just in India but globally as well. I mean, India is obviously a big market, as you mentioned. We currently have only 150 retail stations, but we have big plans to kind of leapfrog the gas-based transportation to electric mobility. So we're looking at EV charging systems, battery swapping. We're looking at power as a big area in India. There's a big program in Shell where our CEO has committed to 100 million people getting access to electricity who currently don't have access to electricity. So India is a big component for Shell to focus in that part. And then we're looking at large-scale solar and wind development activities in India as well.
Because if you were to, and all of these are market opportunities for Shell, but if you were to look at India from a supply chain point of view, what are the components of within supply chain that India typically contributes to? And also, if you talk about the technology development center that you have, has that been in line with your expectation? Has it surpassed your expectation? What has it really contributed to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was less than 100 people in 2005 when it was started, and now I think it's more than 1,000 people. And it's fundamental. It's one of the key pillars for Shell in terms of its engineering team and technology team. So anything that we do in the Middle East and parts of rest of Asia is supported from that center. So it's one of the critical source of talent and engineering work for Shell. I'm not aware of any specific material being sourced from India for us. It's more of using the talent to develop innovation, digitization. That is the primary source for the technology center for us out of India.
And if you can just for a minute talk about the E4 program and some of the key insights from that program and how corporates can engage with the innovation ecosystem.
Yeah. So the E4 program is a pretty recent program. It was started in 2017. E4 stands for Energizing and Enabling Energy Entrepreneurs. So it's a program kind of spearheaded by Shell, but a lot of companies also participate in there. And its primary objective is to find interesting companies. It started with focus on energy, but since then it has expanded to industrial as well as mobility and supply chain areas, where Shell provides a seed capital, 100, 200K in terms of seed capital, but at the same time provide access to some of our global workforce, which can guide the entrepreneurs in terms of their product strategy, as well as most corporates, Shell could be a potential customer as well. Currently, there are about 30 companies in the portfolio. Every year, I think our team looks at more than 100 companies in that program, and I think this year we'll be selecting about 10 companies in that program. Some of them have become much successful beyond India, but they're all India based. One of them actually got funding from Shell Ventures as well. It's in the biofuel space. And then two of the companies are in the logistics area in the portfolio are Logistics Now and QFers. These are both in the digitization of logistics aspect.
And if I were to ask you one insight about how corporates can run successful innovation and startup programs, what would that be?
That's interesting. I mean, we have one insight. I think it has to be very focused to what the corporate is looking for, and if there's a direct fit, it can blossom. But at the same time, it's a risk as well, because a small company can be diverted into a direction which could result in a big challenging position as well. But I think the focus is the key part.
Thanks, Vikas. Oliver, coming to you, obviously India is an important market for you to be awake at 2:30 a.m. in the morning. But why is that so? What is it that makes India an interesting destination for you? Is it only, obviously it cannot be only for the, for the demand, because a lot of your client base is overseas. But is it as a delivery hub? Is it as a, product development center? What are the components that India contributes to in the on-process world?
Well, a lot of our clients are overseas in terms of their headquarters, but of course they have a lot of operations in India as well. For us, India is everything you just mentioned. It's a potential client base. It's an offshore delivery location. It's a great talent hub across our business. We have people within our operations groups. We have a lot of data scientists, analytics-minded folk doing some very clever predictive analytics in the service supply chain. We have a lot of coders, people working on our technology tools, as well as the support of our technology architecture. So I think, I think in total we've got around 700 people over in India. So we have an established workforce there. It's interesting what Charles mentioned about a supply chain being quite analog. In the service supply chain, so where you're trying to fulfill the service lifecycle that has been committed by a provider of that service, whether or not that's a manufacturer or someone else, through the lifecycle of that contract, relevant of the product itself, it does create a lot more opportunities to leverage data of installed devices, of when are they going to fail, data of previous delivery capabilities in certain areas, or to certain hospitals, or to certain data centers. And if you start to see repeat failures within a 2 or 4 hour window, which you often have in very strict SLAs contracts, then that creates the opportunity to predict failure and to try and get ahead of it. Now, as a domestic market, India has been has not, up to this point, has not been such a big opportunity for us, because a lot of companies where we go with some of these algorithms and technology are quite happy with the sort of previous way of putting a lot of people to try and make it right for the customer, and I respect that. I think that can help with a lot of firefighting, a lot of reactive capabilities. But if you look at the sheer volumes, I think there is a huge opportunity to understand the impact on customer experience that can be gained from being able to take different data points from different areas and use the technology and algorithms that are available, and ironically are powered from India for us, or largely from India for us, in order for that domestic market's own advantage. So I think that's probably a trend which is increasing, especially in specific areas or verticals that have a high impact of downtime. So if something isn't fixed within its service window, something bad happens, a financial penalty or worse. Imagine hospitals and what have you. So India is many things for us, Prajat. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm going to ask you two related questions. One is, typically large customers usually had visibility on their tier 1 and tier 2 kind of suppliers. Are you also seeing customers now seeing the need for much deeper visibility on the tier 2, 3, and 4 suppliers as well? And a related question to that, while India may not have been big on automation, post-COVID, given the sentiment that we hear from many other corporates, do you consider India as a large enough market to shift some amount of focus on the Indian side?
Oh, I mean, in terms of scale, I don't think it's a case of large. India is a huge market. I think it's, but I want to link those 2 points if I can, because one thing that we've seen as an impact of COVID is that a lot of supply chain, especially traditionally run service supply chains, where there hasn't been a lot of investment in automation, and that's not limited, certainly not limited, not geographically constrained at all. That could be anywhere. some companies still run planning from Excel sheets. Some companies, just hand over an order many companies hand over an order to a logistics vendor and hope that it gets, the order gets there in time. And then something like COVID-19 comes along, kind of puts a halt to business as usual. And then people say, okay, wait, what's going on right now? Are we fulfilling customer SLAs? Where is our inventory? What's happening in our supply chain? And if it's the companies that haven't invested in automation, the companies that haven't invested in understanding where their data is and how they can connect that data, that are then at a disadvantage, both to manage their cost base, but also to understand how they are performing for their customers. So you see a bit of a scramble there, actually, to be honest. And in order to try and think, okay, well, how can we catch up? And then it drives a conversation, which are, right now, are people trying to solve the tactical problem that there are lumps in their supply chain and things that they can't see? Or are they trying to do that and also have a strategic conversation about how do you change the supply chain, and how and is this the right time to do it when everyone is sitting at home on Zoom? I think that if you look at that sort of paradigm of when to invest, when to solve the problem, and when is normal going to resolve, I think that'll be kind of almost forced upon us just by sheer economic factors of and customer factors of business saying, what am I supposed to be doing? Am I supposed to just continue to pump new inventory into this and ask this of my suppliers? Do I really know if that inventory is just piling up in the field, or is it actually relevant? Is it being consumed by customers? So I think there is a huge need, not just in India, but also certainly in India, but across different geos and verticals, to invest in that kind of digitization.
Great. Thanks, Oliver. One last question to you, and this question I would request some of the other panelists also to chip in. Given your strategic position of what you do with helping companies optimize and digitize their supply chains, you have a ringside view of how they are thinking about their global supply chains. And in that context, when you think of some of your overseas customers or some of your European or US customers, how do they think about China and India, and what are some of the contrasting things that they sort of highlight for and against India, for example, in comparison to China? And Vikas and Arvind, I would request you to also chip in with your corporate views on this.
I'm happy to kick that off. I am wary of too much of a sweeping statement of an answer here. So, but I will answer it directly for some of our bigger customers. We tend to see that from a supply chain perspective, that there is a larger supplier base in China and a larger service network, as in things like support operations and a lot more data teams, technology teams that are based in India. So again, that's a general statement, and I don't. It's just sort of my experience of how I see it. Whereas so you have a lot of flow of supply chain materials moving from China to, for example, to the US or to Europe or what have you. But a lot of the same companies that are putting that material across really rely very heavily for that supply chain to function on the talent pool that sits in India, developing the technology to be able to give things like, the visibility of their supply chain and be able to act on that supply chain, as well, of course, as then that material coming into the domestic market.
Thanks. Thanks. Good insights, Arvind.
I'll jump in here real quick and ask a follow-up to Oliver. Oliver, do you think this is, and maybe this is something that the other panelists can also chime in on, the division that you talked about, do you think some of that shifting with, as people have started thinking about the reliability and the effectiveness of the challenges and the dependency on all of the supply chain, the produce coming from one part of the world, do you see any of that shift happening as part of this pause?
I think that's a wider question about the manufacturing industry in general. But I think one thing that one thing that COVID-19 perhaps has made us all wary of is when you lose the capabilities to move things around between countries as easily, your ability to source locally is more important, because it gives you an opportunity to source. Then you also see huge sways in reactions to different things. For example, in India, I think there was a lot of the repair factories which are creating remanufactured stock to be able to send out, all got shut down under government order, whereas, for example, in Hungary, they didn't. So in Eastern Europe, they carried on repairing and refurbishing, so that suddenly had a swell in volume, whereas a lot of the repair shops in India, I'm informed by many of our customers, they sat idle for a month. But of course, that's just one example. I think nearshoring of inventory, both from a supply, stock, and remanufacture perspective, is increasingly relevant.
Interesting points, Arvind, and then Vikas. Your thoughts on your views about India versus China?
Well, I think I will agree with Oliver in terms of supply chain and what India's capabilities are compared to China. I think China is quite established in terms of their infrastructure, and India depends on what it is. Certainly, software, engineering, and other services, India has a lot of strength and talent to deliver. But if you look at purely manufactured products, it really depends. I think we need to look at gearing up our infrastructure and really scaling it up and meeting this global demand. I really wish for India to be a strong alternative to China, but I think it will take time in certain areas to get that developed.
But Arvind, do you see the government intent and policies now very quickly and very rapidly aligning to capturing some of the opportunities of people moving out of the dependencies on China? Do you see that as a positive development, and do you see that actually playing out rather than just rhetoric?
Yeah, of course, there is good intent, and it just depends on how quickly we adapt to this, because there are obviously other alternatives to India as a supply base, and I'm sure several markets and countries around the world are also looking to diversifying their supply base, looking at local sources, among other things.
Wonderful. And Vikas, what's the Shell view on this?
I mean, we have presence in both the countries. In fact, China, I think, currently is a bigger market for Shell. What I see difference between the two countries, personally from San Francisco, when I look at investment opportunities, is I think China, typically the startups we see are very similar in terms of what's being done in the US, whereas for Indian startups, what we see, they tend to develop solutions which are very India-centric and much different. For example, here we have an investment it's pretty common now in India, but here we have investment in a company that does battery swapping instead of battery charging. In India, cars are not even being thought about. People are now looking at doing battery swapping just for scooters, for rickshaws, things like that are very specific, I would say, solutions to India. And I think that will happen in other areas that we are looking at.
Prajit, can I add on to this?
Yes, of course, please.
Yeah, I think the question is much bigger beyond China, India benefiting because China is going to be questioned. I think the question gets to be much bigger because I think if there's one thing that COVID questioned is decentralization over centralization. I think China just became such a lucrative, going back historically, it became just such a lucrative manufacturing base, sourcing base because of cheap land, cheap labor. That's how it started, and very favorable government policies. And by the time the world kind of even could plan out its plan B and C, everyone loved China so much for all the costs that everything ended up happening in China much more than its second and third and fourth preferred location. I think second, third, fourth all put together were less than half of China for most of the large sourcing bases. We all know that, we've all seen that. I think in some small ways, India did the same with pharmaceutical. I think the way India ended up hurting the world when paracetamol and hydroxychloroquine for whether it's effective or not doesn't matter. But when those drugs were in demand and 95% of the global generic manufacturing capability was sitting out of India, I think we did the same. So I think what's going to happen is, for a very large part, people are going to question decentralization over, or rather question decentralization being the more preferred mode, a more fragmented supply chain, a more distributed supply chain, a more agile supply chain. And I think in light of that, India is going to benefit, not because of China going down or China will go down. No. I think we'll benefit because India is agile, India is young, all things Charles said, which were related to the fact that you have 1.0 and 4.0 coexisting, and therefore innovation is going to be more disruptively innovative, if there is a phrase like that. Because of all those reasons, I think just we'll end up standing up so many use cases. To the point Vikas said, I didn't know this, by the way, that battery swapping in India was happening with rickshaws and scooters and all that. Now just imagine what that will do to battery compression, what that will do to the cost of manufacturing, what that will do to the use cases that come out of it. So I think because of all that reasons, typically what I've seen is, and we do end up seeing quite a few countries, but innovation out of India just ends up being much more agile, unitized, and more variant use cases than anywhere else, just because that's what this country is.
No, absolutely relevant points.
Pajak, if I can jump in just really quickly to kind of tie this together. So what Oliver said, and then Rohit and some of the other, and especially the Arvind and Vikas, I'm looking just at Indian companies that are solving Indian solutions. And if you come from an outsider's view, you typically have Indian entrepreneurship 1.0 was Infosys and Wipro in developing these now large, huge companies that use engineering, the incredible brain talent of India, right, to help solve problems that are outside of India. But when you're looking now at 1.3 billion people and an upwardly mobile economy with kind of secular growth patterns that aren't really dependent on export and some of the other industries that tie China or other places to the rest of the world, and you have the youngest population globally, we're seeing the companies that we're looking at, the startups that we're looking at, are solving problems for large brand name companies that can only be solved by Indian solutions. You can't bring Kuehne Nagel into India and have them solve supply chain and logistics problems. You can't drop UPS into India and have them solve the supply chain and logistics problems. 85% of the vehicles on the road in India are 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. So when people talk about I came from a tier 1 supplier in the automotive industry. And so when you start talking about vehicles, I immediately think passenger cars and large vehicles. And that's just not the market in India. The market in India, and we have, in India, you have 100cc, motorcycles being a whole class and smaller. And that's not even a class in the rest of the world. So the size of the market and the specific use cases for the Indian market. And now when you see the Tatas and Bajajas looking to their supply chain, and then Flipkart and Amazon and Swiggy and Zomato and Ola and Uber being businesses that didn't really exist a handful of years ago, serving this population that's completely digitized. Cell phone service is virtually free in India. It's the cheapest globally. I have 4 lines in India for 999 rupees with unlimited text and call and 120 gigabytes of data a month. So I set 3 of them just to stream Netflix, perpetually, to see if I can reach my, monthly quota. So you have this digitized, younger, youthful population. There's 400 million people in India under the age of 25. There's more people under the age of 25 in India than there are people in the United States. And so when you have that population dealing with a digitized world and the infrastructure problems of India, that's where I think it's really interesting. The problems that we're talking now about, are there going to be global shifts and people don't want to sole source? Are they going to geographically distribute? I hope so, but that's, I think, as Arvind, intimated, that's maybe 8 years down the line. It's not 8 months down the line, but the technology, providers that you're seeing, that have just exploded in India, the Black Buck, Revigo, Delivery, those are all supply. eCard, if you break it off of Flipkart, these are all kind of unicorns in India, and they're still a tiny sliver of the market. They're still really small compared to large distribution supply chain players globally.
Absolutely valid point, Charles. And if you think about Indian companies solving Indian problems, there's a lot more work happening on autonomous tractors in India than is happening on autonomous vehicles or passenger vehicles, because the market or the infrastructure is just not ready. So folks, with that, I'm going to hand over back to Ashutosh to talk a little bit about supply chain lab before we then wrap up.
No, absolutely. And taking cue from what the panelists were saying, India as a market has completely different characteristics, and it's a big market on its own, right? So, and we come from an operating investment background, which means that as Loomis partners, we have been investing and managing businesses throughout the decade-long journey that we have, right? And when we started looking at specifically India as far as supply chain is concerned, a couple of years back, right, we found really good offshoots of what India can become, in the next 5 to 7 to 10 years, right? So taking the cue from Oliver, right, even before COVID, right, there were strategic shifts that were happening in the global behavior towards India. And in the last 2 years, those have been accelerated with the help of policies, with the help of investor money coming in, and the quality of startups that have started to emerge. And then with the last nail in the coffin, if I may actually use that phrase, is the COVID era, because of which the borders are shut everywhere. If you see the global traffic container movement between a particular lane that has dropped by 1/10. If 5,000 ships were moving in between Nava Sheva port and Rotterdam in Amsterdam, then in Netherlands, then it has scaled down to 500 ships only in the last few months. So with all of that disruption that is happening, India as a market of 400 million below 25 age of people has emerged to be a great domestic market. Right now, how do you satisfy this market? Right, there are a variety of ways in which various startups are beginning to function. One big common theme, as I keep on saying, is how do you move things from one place to the other, because a lot of services and goods that is ultimately required on ground. So when we started looking at investing in India, we said that investing would have to be taken with an ecosystem approach, and that's a genesis of Supply Chain Labs. Last year, we put together a framework which included corporates, other investors, mentors, really world-class mentors, and MIT as academic partner. With this framework, we invited applications. We were really blessed to get a lot of involvement from the startup ecosystem. We got close to 600 plus applications. We ran the cohort for 6 months. We're lucky to actually finish it right before COVID storm hit. So we finished it in February. We have seen, the kind of problem statements that the startups are solving, and these are India-specific problems. But now, with boundaries getting shut, the technology companies are having a field day. So that is one big learning, which we are seeing in the Supply Chain Lab story. The other big learning is the fact that corporates are much more, accustomed now to working in a face-off manner, in a completely digitized manner, and looking at companies which are still small, very small as compared to what they usually expect a company to be, but having a solution which can solve a point problem, and they will go on with it. So Shrohit, would you like to add anything here?
Yes, Ashutosh. Just a bit of flavor on what you said about Indian problems, and then merging that with the point you said about technology companies having a field day. I think if you put the two together, actually, your boundaries start blurring between Indian problems and global problems, particularly for technology companies. These are companies which are solving problems of demand aggregation, and I'm picking supply chain specific as an example. Demand aggregation built on very nifty algorithms, built on very high speed supply side recalibrations of network design. These are companies which are looking at exposure to how the network will fail in various scenarios and helping you. I don't know how many of you in your large companies have seen this, and it's always been a challenge, and Oliver, we can talk all day about it. But for every fulfillment, can you do a plan B and a plan C? You don't do it for every fulfillment. You do it for a week, you do it for a month, you do it for a year, you do it for a whatever period of planning. The companies coming up now, which are saying every fulfillment will have a plan B and plan C. I'm shipping out this $5 thing. I need to have a plan B and a plan C backup to what happens if the prime logistic route lane carrier fails on this. And just imagine doing that day in and day out, doing that at such a low cost, doing that with enough data points on the algorithm that it is viable enough, which is what's happening. So I think the point I'm coming to is the objective at Supply Chain Labs is actually to ideally not just identify such companies and work with them, but help these companies become what we call enterprise scale ready. And enterprise scale ready is the Shell scale, it's the ABB scale, it's the Cisco scale. It's getting those scales ready by exposing them very early in their life cycle and their product definition, and with their innovation headset, very early to what a Shell is thinking. Why is Shell struggling with this? What can Shell do better? So on and so forth. And I think those use cases can really stretch the stature of these companies, not just for India kind of use cases, but for global use cases, not just because, the point Charles, you were making, not just because they're not able to locate, beyond the 8 months, but because honestly, a lot of problems are now becoming fairly common problems for these technology companies. So I think where I slightly differ with the boundaries thing is the fact that for technology companies, honestly, boundaries don't even exist.
Yeah, no, makes sense. So in the interest of time, I will now request Nitin to actually, make his point, and then we should be wrapping up by taking questions.
Sure. Thanks, Ashutosh. And thanks to all of you. I think one of the things, we have one of those as listed as questions here, but I want to recognize Gunjan. He recently wrote this article on HBR, which I'm sure all of you must have seen and read, about what's happening in the supply chain industry and how this is, maybe I can call it such, once in a lifetime opportunity for manufacturing in India. And I think what his point is that, yes, China is obviously big in manufacturing, but we should recognize and talk about things that India is strong about, and maybe look at that as options as we evaluate. And I think it resonates with the points that you guys are making. It just is not more of a China versus India. It's more of a what are the opportunities that are available in India as far as manufacturing is concerned. I do want to quickly go through and take a look at the questions. One of the questions here is, most of the attendees here are based in Southern California. And are we, with the portfolio companies that you have, are you looking for any kind of a presence here or any kind of partnerships? Any quick responses from the panel?
Nitin, you might want to direct the question to someone.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I'm saying that, do you want to direct the question to someone in specific?
Well, in the interest of time, I'm just, if one or two of you want to jump in real quick. And
Nitin, you said the question was about presence in Southern California for some of the portfolio companies?
Correct, because most of the attendees are based here. So is there anything in specific that...
I think it's a huge market. Obviously it's even if I just look at Oliver Lemansky, who's sitting right there, some of his businesses, some of his clients are already there as an example. I don't think it's a market anyone can ignore. I think what becomes very interesting is when your presence in a market is pivoted with a strategic partner who's not just, who knows the market landscape much better, who knows initial clients much better, who can help you innovate in the context of that local client base. That becomes very interesting. So I would say that absolutely outrightly, yes, if there are things to be considered which are out of the box, not just a presence, but presence with plus. It's always highly accretive. It's a huge market, a market of huge relevance.
Makes sense. Another question here was around if any of you have had any experience with the supply chain in hospitals or healthcare. And is there anything in specific that you worked on during these times with COVID. Oliver, I think you had.
Yeah, I saw that question pop up. That's a question from Ramesh Krish, I think, at Prime Healthcare. Ramesh, you very kindly sent your cell and your email address. If it's all right, I'll pass it on to a very well-informed guy in my organization called Chris, who can reach out to you. I think, yeah, I mean, hospitals in the US right now getting parts in and out of hospitals, understanding how to get clear the backlog, be able to manage very strange volumes of stuff, whether or not that's PPE gear or whether or not it's more traditional supply chain materials coming in and out of hospitals. Yeah, we do a lot of work with radiotherapy companies and others who are trying to keep equipment running in hospitals, and the challenges are all over the place at the moment, but we certainly have some experience helping with that. I don't think it's such a panel question because the variability is very, very significant across different hospitals, and whether or not you're talking about the actual medical device within the hospital or, for example, protective equipment. But happy to bring up the conversation with you separately.
Perfect. Well, thank you once again, all of you. Oliver, especially to you, but also to folks in India for making it so early. And I think we had a pretty successful discussion, and we really appreciate you making the time and joining us here with this webinar at TiE SoCal. Anshuman, any last words?
Thank you, everyone. Certainly, Oliver, from UK and folks from India. Nice debate and nice point, the way you guys answered all the questions, and by giving your email address and all, I think it would be very helpful for us. I think there were a couple of questions from Shankaram about the investment portfolio and all those things. So we'll pass on along those answers, and then we'll be in touch with you also. Thank you so much.
Great, really appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.